Yesterday was day 15 of the Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard defamation trial. It was all Amber Heard all day. Let's talk about it. Hey everyone, welcome to Legalbytes. If you're new here, my name is Alita. I'm a lawyer licensed in California and DC, and on this channel, we explain the law one bite at a time. So today, Amber Heard continued her direct examination by Elaine Bredehoft of the Heard legal team, with Camille Vasquez charged with objections by the Depp legal team. We did not finish Amber's direct examination by the end of the day, so I anticipate Ms. Bredehoft to be questioning Amber through much of day 16, if not into day 17. Following that, it looks like Ms. Vasquez is going to be the one to do her cross-examination. Now, before I get into the substance of the testimony of day 15, let me give you some overall highlight thoughts of the day. First off, looking at yesterday, I could see how someone may have believed Amber's testimony, especially at the beginning where she detailed how her relationship with Johnny began. In fact, I do have the general impression that she loved, if not Johnny, then at least that phase of her life when she was at the beginning stages of her relationship with him. But today, as she continued to talk, things started to fail to add up. I'll get into more of that, but for now, suffice it to say that the more she talks, the more unbelievable I find her testimony. Aside from that, I think Ms. Vasquez of the Depp legal team was absolutely on fire. I'm trying to keep my expectations of the upcoming cross-examination of Amber tempered because it's going to be a really high-pressure cross and a lot of things can honestly happen. But if Ms. Vasquez's performance with these objections on day 15 is any kind of an indication of how she'll do on cross, I'm thinking we might be in store for some amazing lawyering coming up. Particularly after some time into the direct examination, Ms. Vasquez started interrupting the flow of Ms. Bredehoft's direct examination with objections. And the thing about doing that is it can be really effective to interrupt the attention of the jury as well as the emotional load of the witness testifying. This is particularly true where the witness is very, very emotional in their testimony. It can also trip up the attorney that is doing the direct examination by pulling them out of the zone so that they have to defend themselves in order to stave off these objections. On the other hand, too many objections can also backfire if the jury starts to feel like the objecting attorney is either trying to hide information from getting to the jury, or if they feel like the objecting attorney is just getting in the way of something that they're keenly interested in. Part of this comes down to tone, and I really think that Ms. Vasquez achieved the right tone perfectly here. And what's more, her objections were always immediate and on point. Although she didn't win every single objection, her batting average was actually pretty insanely high, especially as she started to get Ms. Bredehoft really stuck in the weeds. As an example, there were times where Ms. Bredehoft would ask a question, Ms. Vasquez would object on, say, foundation. Then Judge Azcarate would sustain Ms. Vasquez's objection, meaning that she won. Then Ms. Bredehoft would rephrase to ask in a different way, and Ms. Vasquez would come back and object again with a different objection, say, like hearsay. And you could really hear Ms. Bredehoft get increasingly frustrated and then at times argue with the judge's ruling. Usually not the best idea. Many times the two lawyers would approach the bench for a sidebar so they could argue the objection outside the presence of the jury. Generally speaking, that is a good idea so that the jury doesn't start to hear certain arguments that tip them off to different things that might be misleading or might be confusing. Anyway, then they'd go back and Ms. Bredehoft would ask a very different question. And there was even one time that Ms. Vasquez immediately objected again in this kind of a scenario, and Judge Azcarate responded in a sing-songy style, "Sustained." This indicated to me that Judge Azcarate was also starting to get frustrated with Ms. Bredehoft's line of questioning. Remember that she really doesn't do much to indicate to the jury any amount of favoritism one way or another. She's actually pretty unreadable in that regard. So as a lawyer watching this, seeing any kind of small shift in her tone like that, to me really jumps out because it's a little bit of a shift from her usual staunch unreadability. But the part about Ms. Vasquez's tone was perfect. She never had any attitude, no righteous indignation, nothing. At times, it seemed like she was almost whispering into the microphone, "Objection." The soft tone was exactly what was necessary to get those objections in, to interrupt this kind of testimony without looking like an a-hole. As an example, Ms. Bredehoft would ask a question, and Amber would go into a long narrative that was filled with emotion and flowery language, and Ms. Vasquez would end up punctuating it with "objection, non-responsive." The beauty of that was that her tone wasn't disrespectful at all, but the nature of the objection indicated that Amber was bullshitting instead of answering the question. It really was pretty brilliant. Okay, let's get into some of the testimony here so I can explain what I mean when I say that the longer Amber seems to go on, the less that I personally believe her. First, she mentions throughout that her memories in a lot of these instances are incomplete and that she gets just flashes of these memories as opposed to complete narratives. And yet her stories are actually very fine detail. Kind of. You see, something that I noticed about Amber's retelling of these events is that she tends to be very elaborate about superfluous details to the story. Essentially, unimpeachable details like birds getting in the house or the carpet being dirty when she's knocked onto it. Things that aren't really necessary for her allegations, and yet are also things that no one could really call her out on for a falsity. And yet when it comes to things that she said and did during these alleged violent incidents, she seems to draw some blanks. Now, I am not a psychologist, and I'm not someone with any kind of extensive experience with trauma patients or treatments or anything like that. And I do understand that the brain has a way of protecting itself from traumatic memories by blanking them out or sometimes distorting them in various ways. But the way Amber's supposedly traumatic memories are coming out isn't how I have understood that to work. To me, it just seems like someone who has come up with a story and wants to make it seem realistic by embellishing details, but in a sort of a safe way so that she can't be caught in those lies. Another thing that she did a lot of during her testimony was watch the jury, both as she spoke and as the attorneys argued in the sidebar with the judge. To me personally, this seemed like she was trying to sell her story. Now, don't get me wrong, this on its own isn't a problem because even if we were to assume that her testimony is real, her believability has very important repercussions for her. So I would understand why she would want to be very passionate about having people understand her story and where she's coming from. So I don't want anyone to think that just because a certain party is showing an interest in getting the jury over to their side, that it means that they're somehow lying. It's just that, to me, those points of connection seem to come most when she was getting particularly emotional while talking about these alleged events. Now, although it's definitely not a rule to take to the bank by any means, I found that when most people break down and cry in front of strangers, they usually shell up and go inside themselves because it's really embarrassing for a lot of people to break down like that. It shows a lot of vulnerability and just a lot of emotion that most people don't walk around revealing to the whole world. But at those moments in particular, she would break down, and then at some point, either during or right afterwards, she would turn her head kind of to the jury, almost to see if the jury was with her. Now, contrast that to Johnny's testimony, where you could tell visually that he was sort of living in the memory of the incident that he was talking about. There were times where you could see that he had sort of a 5,000-yard stare in his eyes, so to speak, and where he was turning back into his head to explain it from start to finish. This felt very different from what Amber was doing here. Now, I also want to get into a couple of the incidents that she touched on today to highlight my sincerest skepticism as to her story with the logic of how things are lining up here. And when I say that, I also want to remind the viewers and at times remind myself that I want to try to keep my brain at least 10% open so that I can allow myself to be open to new information. This is one person's testimony, and she ostensibly has other witnesses that will be coming up to support her narrative and support her case as well. So there is always a possibility that this could change based on some corroboration by some other witnesses. Anyway, the first detail that came up that really stuck out at me was the fact that she gave a narrative about how she was actually the one who insisted on a prenup with Johnny. And she said that Johnny's response was that the only way out of the marriage was through death. And what's more, she said that Johnny then basically accused her of trying to get out of the marriage at such an early stage. Now, aside from the dramatic nature of that macabre sounding kind of statement, this just doesn't make any sense to me at all, just logic wise. Why would Amber, the self-proclaimed unknown actor at the time, or at least at the time that she met him anyway, be the one to push for a prenup? And why would Johnny push back so hard when he's the one who is the established international celebrity. Now, I will be the first to say that prenups, as at least an idea and a conversation, can be a really great thing for couples all around, because at a bare minimum, it can open up some very important conversations between the couples about marriage, finances, kids, and how they want to basically organize the rest of their lives together. But in this situation, this just doesn't add up. Given their power imbalance going into this marriage, a prenup really would have primarily protected Johnny from being cleaned out by Amber in a divorce. It seems that she really had no assets to protect at the time. So for her, it would make sense if they didn't actually have a prenup rather than if they did. After all, Johnny was the one with all the money and arguably needed that kind of protection. Anyway, another point that jumped out at me as a little bit sus was her account of the Boston to LA flight. According to Amber, she had just finished filming a movie where she had a sex scene with James Franco. And once they got onto this flight back to Los Angeles, she said that Johnny was incredibly accusatory about the scene and started slamming her with a barrage of insults and accusations about it. Then she said that he started throwing things at her until ultimately she got up and started walking away from him, at which time he violently kicked her in the back, knocking her down. She said that it was absolutely mortifying because it was in front of a bunch of people on that flight who saw him kick her. Now, before today, we have heard about this flight from other individuals who came on as witnesses and testified to very, very different stories from what Amber is telling us now. But she justified their different accounts by saying that they basically were all in on encircling and saving Johnny from any kind of conflict or controversy. But the problem with that is, before we heard this version of events today, the jury has had some really good opportunities to evaluate all of those people on that flight and to determine whether or not they find the testimonies credible. But in one fell swoop, Amber is asking the jury to just toss out all that time and evaluation that they already had with these witnesses and to just trust her instead. And I personally think that that is asking a lot of an objective jury. Finally, we started to see some photos that show her alleged injuries from these incredibly violent incidents as Amber has described them. First, the photos that she uses, she says show black eyes, broken noses, and more. But when you look at them, especially after the way that she's described these violent incidents, they look really, really weak. It's tough to look at these photos and say, yeah, that looks like a broken nose. Yeah, those look like black eyes. And this is especially true given that she said that those photos were taken like a day or two after the incident. And another issue that I have with her testimony with regard to photos is that there were multiple times where she referenced photos of alleged injuries that she didn't end up admitting into evidence. This reminded me quite a bit of the unnamed lady love interest in Joshua Tree and on the Moscow flight, where we didn't have their names and we ostensibly will not be hearing from them to corroborate her story. It seems to suggest to me that the referred detail is not actually even real, maybe. And the problem is, although she's alleged 14 different incidents in her case, the more that she has these kinds of issues with lining up real, credible, objective evidence with her version of the events, the more you start to really discredit her entirely as a witness, which means that the jury might not even need to look at all 14 incidents to determine whether Johnny actually did abuse her in any of those incidents. But did you watch the day 15 testimony? If so, I really would love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. Otherwise, I hope you found this interesting or at least informative. And if you did, I would love it if you hit the like button. It does help us with the YouTube algorithm gods. And if you haven't done so already, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you can find out when the next video is uploaded, and so you can join us for day 16 of the Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard defamation trial, picking back up on May 16th, 2022, after a week-long break for the judge to have a judicial conference for other matters. Anyway, see you in the next video.